Leading family lawyers have told 5 Live that they've seen a significant rise in the number of court battles where one parent wants to take a child to live abroad. The National Association of Family Lawyers says the rise is a result of the global jobs market and the fact that more mothers are in better jobs and therefore have more money to fund court cases. Parents involved, mainly fathers, point out what damage this does to the relationship between the child and the parent left behind. And one father has told us he thinks too many family judges are seeing contact by Skype as a legitimate means of real contact between parents and children. I'll be speaking to 2 dads who fought to stop their ex-partners taking their sons out the country. We've changed their names to protect the children's identities. John was unsuccessful. His 3-year-old son is now living in New Zealand. But Mark did successfully prevent his ex-wife moving their then 9-year-old son to Germany.
It was basically joint custody. My son would come and go as he pleased. So it was basically 50-50, but he would spend the odd week with me and then he'd be back to his mum. It was just very relaxed at the time.
And you were both living in the same area?
Yes.
Then all of a sudden, she was in another relationship and she said she wanted to take your son abroad.
I didn't first hear that from her. I heard it from my son. He announced it when we were on our way to judo one night, and he announced that he was moving to Germany one day. So I'd had no conversation previously with my ex.
And could he compute that?
No, I don't think he quite understood what that meant. And it was difficult to have a conversation with him without actually understanding what was going on, whether that was just something he'd overheard that potentially could happen in the future, or whether it was a reality for him or not.
And what went through your head?
I wasn't quite sure at that stage what was going on. I just found it more difficult because I wasn't able to have that conversation with him because I didn't understand what was going on. So it was just shock at the first instance. And I think I remember my reaction being over my dead body, which wasn't quite the response I should have been given at the time.
I suppose you must have thought, well, she just can't do this. Surely the law doesn't allow this.
That's your first thoughts, but when you start getting into family law, then you realise that it happens every single day to very, very good fathers. And that was something that I learned very, very quickly, that I didn't feel as if I had much of a chance of preventing him from moving abroad.
And what persuaded you to fight then?
I stumbled across a website called the Custody Minefield, and that started just giving me a little insight into what was happening in terms of the law and how the law was being applied, and how I could start beginning to think about putting a case together. At that point, I started visiting a number of solicitors to try and gauge what the response would be, or how we could start putting a plan together. But the more solicitors I visited, the more I realised I had very, very little chance of actually preventing my son from going. Majority of solicitors were just advising us that they would fight for access during the school holidays. They weren't willing to consider going for custody at the time. And even if they were, I wasn't in a position to be able to afford the costs for that. Majority of them were asking us for around 10,000 just to get to court, and then it would be the cost of barristers on top of that. So I'd resigned myself to the fact that I wasn't actually going to be able to see my son until, a couple of weeks in the school holidays, if I could get the time off, or I could afford the flights out to Germany myself. And then I wrote a piece for a website online, and out of the blue I got a phone call. It was somebody who'd been a solicitor down in London who'd previously worked in family law. And I don't remember much about that conversation, but we were on the phone for a good hour or so, but there's one bit that actually sticks in my mind. I think that's what clicked for me and what changed everything. He asked us to picture a scenario of driving my son to the airport, and I would have to picture a life without him. He was off to start a new life without me, and that was the time that I actually broke, and everything started to make sense then. And that's when I knew that regardless of what the law was saying, that I would continue to fight, and I wouldn't stop fighting until I actually had custody of my son.
Did it go to court then?
Most of it was resolved prior to going to court, but it was still up in the air until the day we actually got to court. It was a very, very strange time, and it was a very, very difficult and distressing time for him. And it was a distressing time after she left as well, which is something that the system doesn't take into account. So
in the end, she went away without him?
She still went away without him, yes. I'd continued to fight. I'd been advised very, very well by this Mike Robinson who runs the Custody Minefield about just building the case bit by bit and making sure that we stick to the facts about the information that I had in relation to the relationship that I had with my son. And that slowly just built. School got behind us, family members were getting behind us, so I had the full support. And I think that's when the ex-wife started realising that this wasn't in his best interests. And I like to believe she thought it wasn't in his best interests.
Can you remember now, and we're going back a few years, but can you remember now what that feeling was like in the pit of your stomach, where you thought you might not be being...
You wouldn't believe the range of emotions that you actually go through, and it was the types of emotions that I didn't even know existed. It's possibly the darkest point in my life, when you realise that everything that you live for is going to be ripped apart. It's not something I could actually make sense of at the time. I went through a period where, during the time where I thought I couldn't fight for access to couldn't fight for custody with my son, I actually began resenting him being with me, because I felt if he could go, and he could go very, very quickly, I could get over it quicker. Because I knew all of the time, every day we were getting closer to his move date, and I just wanted him gone. I wanted to be able to grieve, if you like, and to get that out of my system, because I was trying to stay strong for him and show him that whatever his mother was doing, I was supporting her, even though I wasn't. It was pretty soul destroying at the time, and I think that's one of the biggest problems for a lot of men out there, is that they don't understand the emotions that are attached to the kids.
Would the law have been any different if you'd had suggested taking your son away with you to a posting in Germany or whatever?
I believe at that time it would have been, yes. It was very, very much weighted against fathers at the time, because I think my understanding was that the primary carer, most often in those cases, was viewed as the mother. They were the one who brought up the children, and it wasn't a balanced view, particularly in terms of the case law that was being used at the time. I mean, fortunately, that's now changing, and it's no longer viewed as psychological harm to the mother if they move without the child. The child's starting to become centre stage now, which is brilliant, but we still have an element of secrecy that's shrouding family law at the moment, and we still have a number of judges who are very much outdated and basing their decisions on case law and precedent without actually looking at the individual circumstances of the child. But for me, it goes a bit more deeper than that, and I think there has to be a greater responsibility on the parents as well, that they actually take a common sense approach and sit down and start discussing what's in the best interests of the child, because regardless of the outcome, the psychological damage that they're causing to the kids is absolutely unreal. I mean, the damage that my child suffered was something I don't want to visit again. It was a real dark period for us both.
I wonder if it helped you that she was going to Germany. So let's say if you were based in the northeast of England and she was going to move to Cornwall, for example, which in fact is absolutely no better, because it's still miles away. In fact, you could argue even 100 miles away is no better. I mean, did it help you that you were talking about Germany? If she'd say, what would the law have said if she said, right, I'm going to Penzance?
I think it might have been slightly different, but I do know parents where that has actually happened, and it's still classed as the leave to remove, and it's still granted, and it's no easier. I mean, I always fought for the fact that I would remain within 5-10 minutes distance of wherever my son lived, to make sure that we can maintain that contact. I don't think the law would have been any different.
I mean, you have been through a lot, but I mean, I'd have to class you as one of the lucky ones. If you speak to John now, which isn't his real name, there's a less happy outcome for you, John. What happened to you?
Hi, my son, he's about 3 years old now, just gone 3, and he's ended up moving to New Zealand with my ex-partner, and there's a lot of hostility there, you know, and that's the one thing that made it the worst, is because it wasn't agreed. You know, I didn't give my consent for it to happen. There was no contact promises before he left, and I've been left in limbo, really. And I've now got to pick up the pieces and try and sort of plan how I'm going to see my son.
So he was 4 months old when your girlfriend took him to New Zealand for a holiday.
That's right. Yeah, it was all on good faith. You know, at the time we were very strong. I thought, you know, when my son was born, it was the highlight of our relationship.
And you were in a relationship at the time?
That's right. You know, it was 6 years. We were talking about, you know, the usual things, getting married and maybe more kids, and you just have a long-term view of things, and then all of a sudden, you know, this trouble started happening, and it's not something you expect to deal with, you know.
What is your access now then?
It's virtually none. In court, it was agreed that I'd see him on Skype, and it'd be 2 hours every fortnight. And
that's all you get, 2 hours a fortnight, even on Skype. So you can't Skype every night.
No, that's right. It's been left to my ex-partner's family to arrange, you know, what kind of contact I'm going to have, and I'm lucky to get 20 minutes a fortnight, really, because you put a 3-year-old in front of a computer, you know, they're going to be jumping up and down, running around the house, and you can't sit them in one spot. They don't understand what's happening at all.
Well, under whose jurisdiction was that? The New Zealand court or the courts here?
Now it's all switched over to New Zealand, so I've got to try and go to court over there to start the same process again. But I've saved up enough money to be able to go over it. Everything's planned to go. I'm lucky enough to have family over there that might be able to take me on. Booked the time off work. My work have been very understanding. I just want to see him as much as I can, really, with a view to probably moving over there in the future. But it's a big thing, and it totally changes your life. You have to reshape your whole life.
So can I ask you both, how should the law look? And what I'm trying to get at is that people do split up and people do go on to have new lives. So where does that leave the children if the lives need to move geographically apart? How should it be framed, do you think?
I just wanted to pick a point there about the Skype thing, and this isn't something that's unique to New Zealand, and it's something that's still being dished out by judges in Britain. The fact that they think that reasonable contact can be maintained by Skype, it's an absolute disgrace, and it's still a shocking thing that's happening in family law courts even to this day, and there needs to be something that changes those judges' views, or those judges need to get off that circuit.
So you're saying there's people are being given this gift of a Skype relationship even when they're only a couple of hours away, rather than in New Zealand, where, to be fair, it is the only option.
Yeah, that's part of the contact order, is to Skype rather than actual real relationship. I think that they changed it. Sorry.
That's all right.
No, go on.
I was going to say, you know, I pushed a lot in court. You know, I tried to make it seem like Skype contact was really inconsiderate, and the importance of physical contact with your son and, you know, maybe a daughter, you know, there's nothing that can replace that. If you get a hug from them, you know, it makes your whole world, your whole day, and it's actual contact. Whereas on Skype, you're sort of left wanting, you know.
Yeah.
But what is preventing your contact now, John, is the geography of it rather than the legislation, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, you can't get much further away to live than in New Zealand, and I feel that every day, and I'm sure, you know, as my son gets older, he's going to feel that as well, and that's the scariest thought. You know, he's going to have to grow up, you know, dealing with things that I've had to deal with at an adult stage, but right through his childhood, and that's really scary, actually.
So how should the law look then? Do you think she should have been prevented from going to New Zealand and taking your son with him?
Well, I think, you know, instead of basing everything from her argument, it seemed like I was totally shut down. Anything I wanted to do, any opinions I had, you know, good ideas, what I thought were good ideas, it was totally shut down. Maybe if there was more of a balance, you know, between what both parents want, that should lead the way in court. You should go with the suggestion of both parents, not just the one.
But ultimately, something has got to give. If one partner is going off to Germany or New Zealand or whatever, so what could give? What should
give?
But something does have to give, because if one of you's in the UK and one of you's in another country, then the poor child can't be in both places at once. So, I mean, should the law, for example, say, look, once there's a child involved, you have to stay in the same geographical area? Is that what you'd ask for?
as a minimum, and they need to be taken into account the psychological harm to the child. And at this moment in time, there's still too much emphasis on the psychological harm to the mother if they moved without the child, or if they didn't take the job that was on offer in a different country. I'm sorry, but both parents brought a child into this life, and both parents have a duty and an obligation to make sure that they're both there raising that child. I mean, this child's going through the most important years of his life developmentally, and he needs the love of a stable relationship. He needs the love of his father, and he's dead right that he needs to have that physical contact. And it's about time that the family court started taking that into account when making these crazy decisions.
John?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, actually. We're sort of, as fathers, you feel like you're treated as public enemy number one, because you do so much. You have done all these things for your son or your daughter. You want to be there for your child. You've got all these plans in the future and doing all these nice positive things, and all of a sudden it all gets flipped in court and you become a bad guy for some reason. I don't understand it. If you're willing to make a contribution to your child and not walk away, or be a negative person, you're there from day one, surely that should be taken into account as well. You're there to make a positive impact on your child's life.
I suppose though, Mark, the law is there partly to protect women where the father has disappeared completely, or has hardly anything to do with the child, yet says, well, you're not moving anywhere else with my child, but at the same time has no interest in that child. That does happen. That
does happen, but it happens with mothers as well.
No, absolutely.
So, but that's where a balanced view has to be taken into account. They have to look at both sides, and they have to look at the contact and the bond that both parents actually have, and what's going to be in the best interests of the child.
So, two fathers there talking about the difficulties of the situation when an ex-partner, the mother of their respective children, went to live abroad and wanted to take their child with them. We are actually waiting for the former Prime Minister Tony Blair to give a speech. We also need to speak to a divorce lawyer called Catherine Thomas. We plainly need to clarify how the law actually stands. Catherine, let's just have a good morning from you, and then we're going to have to go straight to Sedgefield to hear from the Prime Minister. But tell me, you can clarify this very dark, very grey area.
Well, there's basically one test, and the test is what is in the best interest of the welfare of the child. Now, unfortunately, when the courts in the past have looked at and how best to frame that, they have, and I think a lot of people who agreed, put too much emphasis on what would happen to the psychological welfare of the parent who wasn't allowed to leave. And for a long time, that was a real focus of the courts. And I and a lot of other lawyers think that was a mistake, and that is something that your contributors just now were discussing. Now, the courts are moving away from that, and they're refocusing back on what is in the best interest of the welfare of the child, and looking at both sides. What is the motivations, and how well planned it is the move. And there's a lot less of a focus on what's going to happen to the parent who isn't allowed to go, and it should be that it's a balanced exercise when the court looks at all the circumstances. But they're extraordinarily difficult cases. I mean, judges torment themselves over what decision is best for any particular family. And I think one of the things that the English courts really do well is that they do really investigate what is going on, and have a lot of input from the parents and from the families around that child to try and work out what is actually best for them.
So plainly they should look at the child's best interest. But what will constitute best interest? Because one parent might argue, look, the best interest here, to clarify matters, the child comes with me, and I can see the other parent every month or something. Then, the best interest is an elastic concept in itself, is the problem.
Yes, exactly. And inevitably, if these cases come to court, you have got one parent saying it's in their best interest to stay, and you've got the other one saying it's in their best interest to leave. So what the judge has to do is look at what that child's life would be if they were to stay, and what it would be like if they were to go. And the English courts take a sort of different approach to a lot of other courts. They will let a lot of people go. The Italian courts, for example, I've spoken to Italian lawyers who say it just never happens. The Italian courts just don't let Italian children leave Italy, because the assumption is they're all better off in Italy. So there is a view with the English courts that it is all right for children to move, but I don't think it's a presumption that they will move.
So let's put it like this. Let's say the parent, and let's say the father, because it does seem generally, for all sorts of reasons, right and wrong, arguably, that the father is the one left behind and the child goes away with the mother. How can that father best protect themselves from that actually happening? So let's say if there's joint custody or joint residency, and the father has the child some of the time, the mother has the child at the time. Sorry, I'll have to wrap that question up, but I do want to get back to this. Don't go away, Cathy. We need to hear from the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Just taking you back to what we were into before, we were talking about where the law stands when a divorced parent, a father usually, finds their child's mother wanting to move abroad with their progeny. Where does the law stand on that? Catherine Thomas is Managing Director of Vardags, the law firm, and a divorce lawyer, essentially. So you were saying that a judge, if it comes to it, a judge will decide what's in the child's best interest. And we were just wondering what is in the child's best interest. Surely to have continuous involvement of both parents should be the first thing.
Exactly, and there is an assumption, a lot of people don't realise this, but there is an assumption that a child should have a relationship with both parents. But one of the things that the court will look at is a move being considered, what was the extent of that relationship, how heavily involved in that child's life was the person who's potentially going to be left behind, and that will very often inform whether the judge is prepared to allow them to move abroad.
So if you are newly separated, newly divorced as a father, and you want to protect yourself from this happening, then you should seek to be, and I'd assume you'd want to be, as involved in that child's life as you possibly can be.
Exactly.
But the trouble is, the other parent, I keep saying the mother, is not necessarily the case, but the other parent might be making that difficult all the time. So, and then that becomes the reality on the ground because you can't fight that.
Well, you could fight it. You can bring contact disputes to court. So even before there's any talk of a move abroad, I mean, if one parent thought that they weren't seeing a child enough or were being held back from contact, then you can bring that issue to the court and ask for more time with the child.
So from the mother's point of view, if the mother wants to persuade the judge that it is the right thing to happen for her to be allowed to take the child abroad, what would she need to do to convince him, or her, in the judge's case?
A lot of it is to do with the research about the move. So how much has that parent thought about and what potential plans have they put in place for the move? So where are they going to live? Where's the child going to be educated? If the child speaks different languages, if you've got a mother and a father who speak different languages and a bilingual child, how is the child going to maintain, both languages? How practically are they going to see the parent who's left behind? All sorts of things like that.
But even that's worrying, isn't it? So you could have a situation where you're seeing your child quite a lot as the father, and the mother announces, "Look, we're moving to California. Got a beautiful house. I've got a lovely partner. There's a fantastic school round the corner. It's all planned. It's all organised." Well, if the judge nods that through, then surely it's a great disservice to the father. It still amounts to taking the child away, no matter how well organised and how beautiful the life is on the other side of the world.
Well, it's obviously going to be part of the consideration because, again, we go back to this test of what's in the best interests of the welfare of the child, and a well-organised, well-thought-out and, high-quality life, new life for the child is going to be stronger than one that isn't very well thought out.
We're talking about when the child is taken abroad, or the desire is for one parent to take the child abroad, but it kind of misses the point in the sense that it must be much more common for people to move to a different part of the country, which doesn't really help matters. I said to one of the fathers earlier, if you're based in, say, Manchester and one of the parents wants to take the child to Penzance, well, frankly, they might as well be in terms of ease of access and getting to them, you might as well be in Germany or France or wherever else. Well, does the law stop you doing that? Have anything to say about moving hundreds of miles away?
Internally, it's much easier to do. The court can still intervene if the parent who's left behind wants to stop that happening. They can ask the court to stop it, but it is a lot easier to move internally.
Which is a worry, surely, for any parent who's been left behind.
Exactly, and you can be in a situation where an internal move, as you said, from Manchester to Penzance, for example, would actually create a lot more sort of distance in terms of time than if you lived in Kent and the child was to move to Paris, for example, where you can nip on the Eurostar relatively quickly. So yeah, it can be very difficult for parents, even internal relocations.
But I just got a text just in from somebody called Jeff. He said, a word of advice to the man whose child is in New Zealand: forget it and move on. I'm in the Midlands. My child went to Leeds. I never see her. The mother calls all the shots. The father still has no rights in reality. Persisting with trying to negotiate with an unreasonable mother only brings a world of hurt and pain to everybody involved, mainly the child. I mean, that is... We'll get many texts on that theme.
Yeah, and it is desperately sad, and this is again, family law situations often come back to this problem with legal aid. Legal aid has effectively almost disappeared now, and what before, a lot more parents could bring issues like this to the courts with the benefit of legal aid, but as it stands now, unless they've got the money to fund privately, very often, they don't have the backup of the courts, and they're just left negotiating with someone, who's not willing to negotiate with them.
Is there an inherent bias in favour of the mother here?
No, there shouldn't be. I think there's been periods where it's been far too heavily weighted. There's too much concern about the mothers, and rather than the fathers, it's shifting away from that. It's shifting back, and there's no presumption that a child is better off with a mother than a father. But the trouble is that practically, in a lot of families, the mother becomes the primary carer and is then in a stronger position if she wants to move in situations like this.
There is another sort of issue to do with the media and the law here, is that it would have been great to have a phone in this morning, people sharing their experiences, but we can't do that for legal reasons, because what you can report in terms of what's happened in a family court is very restricted compared to what you can report that's happened in any other court of law. Now, I'm sure that's there for quite legitimate reasons, but even disguising the identities of people, we can't report what's gone on in a family court. Well, that doesn't help matters, does it? If it's all cloaked in secrecy, how are we ever going to get to the truth of what's gone on?
It does, I think, potentially create more problems, because there's all sorts of rumours flying around about what the law is, and that there's presumptions in favours of the mother, and it all becomes a bit sort of gossip and conjecture. Now, the family courts are generally opening up a lot more than they were. When you're dealing with divorce or finances, the press can now attend those hearings, whereas for a long time they couldn't at all. But where there are children involved, the court's taken the view that that child's right to privacy is so important that there shouldn't be reporting on those cases.
What about the issue of Skype? Do judges really need to rule that, okay, the mother's moving away, the father shall have the right to Skype once a week? Does that kind of thing happen? Is that said?
Yes, that is put in court orders all the time. I mean, it used to be that telephone contact would be put into orders. So, because often, unless these things are put into orders, the person with whom the child lives doesn't go to the effort of getting the child on the phone at a time that works. So it's quite often that used to be in orders. Now, where technology has moved on, you'll very often see Skype or FaceTime rather than the phone calls.
But it's horrifying, really, because that assumes that the parent who has the child is restricting the amount of times the other parent can even Skype or phone call or whatever. That's amazing.
I don't think it's not generally a restriction. It's more an obligation on the person with whom the child lives to make the child available for Skype or FaceTime at those particular times, because the trouble is, and it's not always necessary, because very often people will just sort of work together and make it work. But for some people, unless the person with whom the child is living is told, you have to make the child available at this time, for this period of time, it just won't happen. So it's more a way of ensuring the relationship continues to some extent.
Okay, Catherine, nice talking to you. I wouldn't have your job, lucrative as it might be. What a nightmare area of the law to work in. How do you plead on that?
Good days and bad days.
You should go into politics with an answer like that. Okay, Catherine Thomas there. Thank you very much indeed, from the law firm Vardags.